Tonight, God willing, is our 9th class, and we hope to look at 3 sections: the Rainbowed Angel, chapter 10, then the Temple and 2 Witnesses, chapter 11, and also the 7th trumpet begins to sound, and that's the end of chapter 11. So we're doing 2 chapters, so as I said, it's a lot to do, but we'll try to cover it as best as we can. Now, this slide here just shows you sort of the 7 trumpets. And last week, David did chapter 8 and 9, which dealt with the barbarian invasions for the first 4 trumpets, which conquered and got rid of the Western Roman Empire. And then he did the 5th and 6th trumpet, which dealt with the Arabs and the Turks finally defeating and obliterating the Eastern Roman Empire. Now, the interesting thing about the 6th trumpet, David actually only did half of that. So Revelation 9 verses 13 to 21, where you can see on the screen there, I'm not sure if you can see my slide. Oh, you probably can't see the slide, but you can see here, this bit here, that Revelation 9, 13, 21 deals with the eastern section of the Roman Empire, how the Turks took over that. Now, when we come to chapter 11, which we'll look at shortly, we're going to look at the western side of Europe, deals with that. So basically, we might say trumpet 6A is in Revelation 9, verse 13, 21, and trumpet 6B which happened at the same time, is found in Revelation 11. But in between that, we've got Revelation 10, which is another vision of the future. So that's the Rainbowed Angel. So you've probably seen this telescope view of the book of Revelation, which shows how the seals and the trumpets and the vials and the thunders are mentioned there. They're all various historical things which occur in the time when the saints lived for the last 2,000 years. But during those times, there are interspersed these visions in various chapters, such as we got chapter 7, chapters 4 and 5, also chapter 10 and chapter 14 and 19, which have a vision of the future kingdom. And they're put in all throughout this time period, so that the brethren and sisters who were living in these time periods, generally facing a lot of persecution, they had this vision so they could see, and it could encourage them to endure that persecution that they were going to face. So we're up to now the section here, the trumpets, and as I said, towards the end of the 6th trumpet, we've got the vision of Revelation 10, which is the Rainbowed Angel. So the purpose of, we've got a picture there of the Rainbowed Angel, a very rough drawing of what it looked like. We've got an angel with a rainbow around it, and he's got clouds, and he's got a little scroll, a little book in his hand. So as the slide says, the vision at this time was to remind John that the overthrow of the Roman Empire was not to establish the Ottoman Turks' power permanently, nor would its blasphemies perpetuated by false religions be permitted to continue indefinitely, but ultimately all would be swallowed up by the conquest of the Rainbowed Angel of chapter 10. So to briefly say, what is the Rainbowed Angel? Well, again, it's talking about the multitudinous Christ, or Christ and the saints. That's what the Rainbowed Angel represents. So what he sees in this vision in chapter 10, he sees an angel clothed with clouds descend from heaven, its face like with a sunlight brightness, and his head encircled with a rainbow. And his feet had pillars of fire, and he bestrides the earth as a conqueror. And he shouts like a lion's roar. And then there's these 7 thunder peals follow, declaring the matters which John wished to write down, but he was forbidden to tell. So this is actually describing the matters relating to the conquest of the nations after the return of Christ and the battle of Armageddon. Now that verse there about roaring like a lion, we actually find that in other parts of Scripture. For example, in Jeremiah chapter 25, verses 30 and 31, which we have here on the screen, it says there that the Lord shall roar from on high and utter his voice from his holy habitation. He shall mightily roar upon his habitation. He shall give a shout, as they that tread the grapes against the inhabitants of the earth. And a noise shall come even the ends of the earth. For Yahweh hath a controversy with the nations. He will plead with all flesh. He will give them that oath, the wicked to the sword, says the Lord. So this lion's roar is actually talking about really God or Christ through the saints coming to bring judgments upon the nations. And that's going to happen at Armageddon, and also after Armageddon, God's judgments are going to be brought about. And we, as part of the saints, we, God willing, will be part of that rainbowed angel. So we might not think about it. We've got to imagine ourselves in this symbol. We're actually going to be part of this rainbowed angel, and we're going to be going with Christ to bring judgments upon the earth. Now, it mentions in this chapter 10, that the angel had this little book or this little scroll. It's mentioned there in verse 2 and in verse 9, that the angel had a little book or a little scroll. And the reason why it's little is because the contents cover a short period of time, and it contains these judgments, which are called the seven thunders, which are going to be revealed at the coming of Christ. So the seven thunders, we believe, describe further campaigns against the enemies of God after Armageddon. And so John was told, the Apostle John was told, don't write these down yet. You don't need to know them because they're not relevant for this time, but they will be revealed at a future time, especially after Christ returns. Now, it's interesting also that John, when he was given this book or this scroll in verse 10, he's told to take the book and he was told to eat it. And it says that it was in my mouth, sweet as honey, but as soon as I had eaten it, my belly was bitter. So he's again symbolically eating this scroll, which contained these seven thunders, these seven judgments. So it was sweet and it was bitter when he ate it. So it represents two things. It represents the goodness and the severity of God, the goodness that he gives us, his mercy, but also the severity of God's judgments if people disobey. Now, we can see this theme occur in other parts of Scripture, and I've got here we're going to look at just 3 quotes from the Old Testament, which give this idea. So previously in Ezekiel, the prophet Ezekiel actually had to do a similar thing as John. He had to also eat a scroll or a roll. And it says there in Ezekiel 3, which we have there on the screen, so I opened my mouth and he caused me to eat the roll. Then I did eat it, and it was in my mouth as honey for sweetness. And so the Spirit lifted me up and took me away, and I went in bitterness, in the heat of my spirit, by the hand of the Lord that was strong upon me. Also in Jeremiah has a similar thing. He says, Jeremiah, thy words were found, and I did eat them. Thy word was unto me joy and rejoicing of mine heart, for I am called by thy name, O Lord God of hosts. I sat not with the assembly of the mockers, nor rejoiced I and sat alone because of thy hand, for thou hast filled me with indignation. And finally, in Psalm 119, the psalmist says, how sweet are thy words unto my taste, yea, sweeter than honey to my mouth. Through thy precepts I get understanding, therefore I hate every false way. So when we read the Bible, like these prophets, it should have that same impact. The word should be sweet to us because it has got so many amazing things. We read about God's mercy, God's love to us, but it also should fill us with indignation and hate iniquity. So when we see the evil things that the world does today, they're all turning away from God's morality, that should make us angry because they are going astray from God's word. So we see these two sides to God's character and also these two sides to God's word. It is sweet to us, but it should make us hate iniquity. As the psalmist says, he hated every false way. Now, at the end of chapter 10, John is actually told by the angel, it says, he said unto me, thou must prophesy again before many peoples and nations and tongues and kings. So John is actually saying that he's actually has to rise again, and he's going to, one of his missions would be again to go and give prophecies and prophesy again with the nations. And that's probably going to happen, as we've got there on the screen, during the mid-heaven proclamation in Revelation 14:6-7. We'll just read it and then I'll explain. So it says here in Revelation 14, "And I saw another angel fly in the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel to preach unto them that dwell on the earth, and to every nation and kindred and tongue and people, saying with a loud voice, Fear God and give glory to him." So what this is talking about is that after Armageddon, after the Russian armies are destroyed and all the world is going to witness God's great power in destroying Russia in Israel, that shortly after that, the people like John and the saints are going to go out to the nations to proclaim this proclamation of this gospel, telling the nations to submit to Christ. So we are probably going to be involved in that as well. We're going to go out to Australia and to New Zealand and other places and say, please submit to Christ, fear God and give glory to him. And John, the Apostle John's going to do that as well, because if they don't submit, that's when they'll face the judgments of the seven thunders if they don't submit. And we know that there will be nations that will submit and other nations that won't, and they'll face further judgments by the Lord Jesus Christ and the saints. Okay, well, we'll now look at chapter 11, which we've entitled here, the temple and the two witnesses. So we've looked at, as we said, the specific events of the fifth and sixth trumpets, the Saracens and the Turks, how they affected the Eastern Roman Empire and they brought it to an end. But meanwhile, there was believers in the Western Empire, or Western Europe. It was the empire that actually dissolved at that stage, but Europe was still Catholic. And because of that, there were still brethren and sisters who were facing great persecutions. And these persecutions are actually outlined in chapter 11, all that our brethren and sisters had to endure. So I've got here down the bottom of that screen here what I've tried to say at the beginning of the class, that chapter 9 is the fifth and sixth trumpets, or the first part of the sixth trumpet. Chapter 10 breaks in the middle of the sixth trumpet, the vision of the rainbow angel. And then we've got chapter 11, the sixth trumpet resumes and concludes. So we've got the first part of the sixth trumpet in chapter 9. The last part of the sixth trumpet is in chapter 11. And the question is why? Because chapter 9 deals with Eastern Europe, chapter 11 deals with Western Europe. And these are contemporary events in both halves of the empire. So it's separated by the vision of chapter 10 to prevent a confusion of the symbols. So what we're going to read now in chapter 11 happened approximately at the same time as happened with chapter 9, but it's mainly focused upon Western Europe. Now on the screen there, we've got the first three verses of chapter 11, and you notice that I've highlighted a few things in blue and in red. We'll just read those three verses on the screen, which says, and there was given me a reed like unto a rod, and the angel stood and saying, Rise and measure the temple of God, and the altar, and them that worship therein. But the court which is without the temple leave out, and measure it not, for it is given unto the Gentiles, and the holy city that shall tread underfoot 42 months. And I will give power unto my two witnesses, and they shall prophesy 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. Now we've got here just various classes of people described using different symbols sometimes. So I've got there highlighted there, what you see there in blue is actually referring to the true believers, you might say the Christadelphian. So that when we see the temple of God, the altar, them that worship therein, and the holy city, that's talking about the true believers. But the things which are highlighted in red are not true believers. These we might call them as Christians who oppose Catholicism. So these are the court, which is without the temple, and the two witnesses. We'll have a look a bit more about the two witnesses a bit later on. So you can see how God's attitude says the court that is without the temple leave out or cast out. So there's certain people that think they're Christians, they call themselves Christians, but God doesn't regard them as true believers, and he said cast them out of the temple. So as we said, in Revelation 11, we have sometimes different symbols used to describe the same thing. So as we said, that there's various symbols which are used to represent the true believers, the temple of God, the altar, those that worship therein, and the holy city. As we said, these represent the true believers in God. Christadelphians, we might call them. Now, then it talks about, as we said, the two witnesses. These are really people that aren't Christadelphians, and these are actually, there are two witnesses because they're divided into two sections. One, we might say, the civil opposition or the common people, and the next are the religious opposition or Christians in inverted commas. Now, who are they opposing? We're going to have a look at that shortly. Now, in Revelation 12, there's actually a bit more detail about these two witnesses, and we're going to look at that, God willing, next week. So in Revelation 12, it talks about one class of a witness, which is called the earth. Now, that's in Revelation 12, verse 16. And these are people that fight for things such as liberty, equality, fraternity. And then there's another group, which we might call the religious opposition, and these are called the woman in Revelation 12, verse 14. Now, these are the Protestants, people who fought for religious freedom. And as we said, there's another class which doesn't belong in the two witnesses. That's the holy city. That's the true believers. That's the Christadelphians. They don't belong because they, as we're going to see, they didn't use violence in their way of life. As we know, we don't use violence. Christ said, don't fight, don't oppose, or don't do any harm. So they are the two witnesses. They're classified in Revelation 12 as the earth and the woman, and God willing, we'll look a bit more of that next week. So now I've got here those two verses there highlighted, 4 verses there highlighted, which talk about these main protagonists. So verses 1 and 2 talks about the temple and the altar and the holy city, which, as we said, they're the true believers. Now, it says about them that they're going to be tread underfoot for 42 months. They're going to be measured. See how it mentions there, measure the temple. Well, the measurement is actually a time period. So it's basically saying here that the true believers were going to be persecuted. They're going to be trodden underfoot for 42 months. And remember that that's all a symbolic number, as we're going to have a look at shortly. So they are going to face this persecution for this period, the true believers. Now, there's another class, as we just said, the ones that the court that was left out, or the two witnesses, and they're mentioned there in verses 3 and 4. It says, they will give power unto my two witnesses, and they shall prophesy 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. And these are 2 olive trees and 2 candlesticks standing before the God of the earth. Now, this other class, this two witnesses class, as we said, doesn't say they're trodden underfoot, but it says they'll speak out. They're going to prophesy for this time period, 1,260 days. And they're also called the 2 olive trees and the 2 candlesticks. And they're going to be standing before the God of the earth, which we're going to look at shortly. So this is the other class. Now, you might notice that both these two classes have a time period associated with them. The true believers are going to be trodden underfoot 42 months. The two witnesses are going to prophesy for 1,260 days, which, if you think about it, is the same time period, but they are actually different, as we're going to shortly see. They're going to have overlapping. So they deal with two different classes of people. Now, as we saw previously about different symbols used for the saints, for the true believers, we saw that they were called the altar, they were called the temple, and they were called the Holy City. They were all representing the same thing. Well, even the two witnesses, they're called by other symbols and all representing the same thing. So the two witnesses, they are also the same as the two olive trees, which are the same as the two lampstands. And these are, as you said, talking about the nominal Christians and the civil opposition that was there at that time. Now, we mentioned that there were the two different time periods. If you look at just the first half of this thing up the top here, you can see that it talks about the holy city, and which is the true saints in verse 2, and that they were going to be trodden underfoot, they were going to be persecuted, they were going to be measured out with this persecution for a period of 42 months. And that, in again using the day for a year symbol in Revelation, that's 1260 years. And it starts with when the Emperor Phocas declared the primacy of the Pope. That's in 608, 610 AD. And it ends in around 1870 when the papacy lost its temporal power. Now, the second group of people, which is the two witnesses in verse 3, which is the political and religious opposition, we saw that they were also going to prophesy for a period of 1260 days. And again, a day for a year is 1260 years. Their time period starts a bit differently. They start from 312 AD, when Constantine came to power, and in 312 AD, and then it ends 1260 years later in 1572 at the massacre of St. Bartholomew's Day, which is the slaying. That's when the slaying of the witnesses begins. That happens in France. So there we can see, in a nutshell, what those first four verses are talking about, those periods of downtreading. The saints, the true saints, were going to be tread down and persecuted for 42 months. At the same time, well, there was an overlapping time period. There's going to be the two witnesses who have a political and religious opposition. They are also doing it, but as I said, for the same length of time, but slightly different starting and ending points. Now, we said earlier that the true believers weren't part of the two witnesses, and that's because the two witnesses used violence. We just got there on Revelation 11 verses 4 and 5, which we'll just read out. It talks about the olive trees and the lampstands. It says, these, that is the two witnesses, are the two olive trees and the two lampstands standing before the God of the earth. If anyone wants to harm them, fire proceeds out of their mouth and devours their enemies. And if anyone wants to harm them, he must be killed in this manner. So it's talking, now remember, this is, the book of Revelation is actually a book of symbols. So when it talks about fire coming out of the mouth of the witnesses, that's only symbolically, it didn't literally happen that way. But fire is often a symbol of war and of violence, and that's what these two witnesses were going to use in their witnessing against their enemy, which we're going to shortly see who that is. They didn't hold back from using violence. And we know that that's really a commandment of Christ, which we've got there on the bottom of the screen, that Jesus said, he who lives by the sword dies by the sword. So Jesus Christ said not to use violence at any time to defend yourself or to fight against people. So that's why we know that the two witnesses, or the two olive trees, or the two lampstands represents classes of people that didn't have the truth. So I've got here just a bit on the left where it says that anyone who believed in freedom of religion or in political liberty were Protestants against the God of the earth. That's who they were fighting against. The one was the military arm of the other, and indeed it was only the true believers who would not take up the sword in protest. They limited their preaching to the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. So again, that's saying that the true believers, the only weapon that they could use was really the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. They didn't use literal swords. But there were many other witnesses, political and religious, that weren't afraid to use violence. Now, I've got there on the right-hand side here, this man called Ulrich Zwingli, I think his name is pronounced. He was actually a Swiss preacher. He lived just around the time of Martin Luther, in the Reformation, and he's called here the shepherd warrior. Well, he's actually was renowned for he's got carrying a Bible and he carried a sword. And so he is one of those examples of a witness that was not afraid to use violence against the opposition. And there's actually a statue of him, I think, in Switzerland, which shows him carrying a Bible and a sword. But as the Lord Jesus Christ said from that earlier quote, that he who lives by the sword dies by the sword, this man here actually was killed in battle. That's how he actually died. He actually fought in a battle, and he died in that battle. So so Christ's prophecy came to pass, that those that live by the sword will die by the sword. So who was this God of the earth? That was mentioned in verse 4 of Revelation 11. It says that the two olive trees and the two lampstands were standing before the God of the earth. Well, it's not talking about the God of heaven, but during pagan Roman times, the God of the earth was Caesar, and when the empire became Christian, the popes thought themselves as God. And we just have a little quote here from Pope Gregory II, who in the 8th century said, all the lands of the West have their eyes directed towards our humility. By them we are considered as a God upon the earth. So that's, even the popes were not afraid to say that they regarded themselves as a God upon the earth. So the God of the earth is obviously the God that the earth worships, and it represents the popes and the Roman Catholic power. And so now we know who the two witnesses were standing and fighting against. They were fighting against this papal God of the Roman earth, and they delivered that testimony to them. So during all that time when the true saints were being persecuted, we've got these two witnesses who in a way were helping defray the persecution, because they were fighting against the Roman Catholic powers. On that slide there, you can see that around the time of when the Protestant Reformation started, there's some of the various protesters that came. So you've got, for example, Martin Luther, you've got John Knox, you've got Zwingli, who we just talked about, Calvin in France, and there's Catholicism here. Now, it's interesting we talked about the two witnesses, because Martin Luther, he started, we might say, the Reformation in Germany religiously, but there were a lot of princes, German princes in Germany, that actually supported Martin Luther, not so much because they really liked what he was saying, but because he opposed the Catholic Church, and they also were not happy with the Catholic Church. They supported him, and so they were, again, part of that earth class that supported the religious witnesses, and they fought against the God of the earth. Now, it mentions about the witnesses in verse 11 of chapter 11 that they were going to give their testimony and then they were going to die. So in verse 7 of Revelation 11, it says there, as we've got on top of the screen there, and when they shall have finished the testimony, the beast that ascends out of the bottomless pit shall make war against them and overcome them and kill them. So these witnesses were going to witness for a certain time, and then they were going to be put to death. Now, there's a couple of interesting things, or one interesting thing about this verse is that it mentions something called the beast. Now, that's interesting because the book of Revelation so far has not really talked about what the beast is. And that's why I'm raising this now, because that's why next week, God willing, we're going to talk about Revelation 12 and also later on Revelation 13. It talks a bit more about what is this beast system. So if you were reading Revelation for the first time, you might think, what is this beast system that's talking about? Well, you've got to wait till we come to Revelation 12 and Revelation 13, and it talks a bit more about what this beast system was that was fighting and overcame these witnesses. So when did the slaying of the witness begin? We believe that was 1572. We've got here a picture of what happened. It happened in France on St. Bartholomew's Day in 1572, where the French government persecuted and the French Catholics persecuted the Huguenots. Huguenots were Protestants, and they put to death many thousands in France. So we say that's where the beginning of, not quite death, but the beginning of the slaying of the witnesses, of the two witnesses. And so glad were they of this slaughter of the Huguenots that the Roman Catholics fulfilled another part of Revelation 11, because in Revelation 11 verse 10, if you've got your Bibles open, we've got it there at the bottom of the screen anyway, but I'll just read it. And it says, "And they that dwell upon the earth shall rejoice over them and make merry, and shall send gifts to one another, because these two prophets tormented them that dwell on the earth." So it mentions there that they would rejoice over the death of these witnesses, that they will make merry and they will send gifts. And that's exactly what the Roman Catholic Church did with the papacy. They actually created these medals. As you can see, some of those medals up here on the screen. But the Pope here, Pope Gregory, he struck these medals, and at the back of this medal, it says in Latin, "The slaughter of the Huguenots." So they were thought this was really fantastic. They killed all these people, these Protestants, and thought it was a great time to celebrate. So again, we see that amazing fulfillment of what Revelation 11 verse 10 was saying about these two witnesses, the beginning of them being put to death, and the papacy rejoicing over them by striking these medals. Now, later on, we believe that the witnesses actually came to their final political death a few years later in 1685, because in 1598 in France, one of the kings created the Edict of Nantes, and that was an edict which said that you stopped the persecution of the witnesses, basically. But then that was reversed in 1685 when the next king of France said, "No, we want to keep persecuting and putting to death these Protestants." So in 1685, we say that's when the two witnesses, finally suffered a political death. And once again, in 1685, what does the papacy do? They create these medals to celebrate this. And in the medals, as you can see here on the left, they've got the woman there standing upon a dead person, probably a dead Protestant. And this in Latin, it means here, heresies extinguished. And here on the other side of the medal, it says, "Religion conquered, the temple of Calvin overthrown." So again, they were celebrating that they had put to death the witnesses against the Catholic Church. So again, amazing fulfillment of what Revelation was saying and was predicted by God. And so once again, we see here finally that the two witnesses that were witnessing against the Roman Catholic power, they were put to death politically, we might say. Now, it mentions where all this was going to happen. So in Revelation 11 there, verse 8, which we've got there on the screen, it says there that the dead bodies of the two witnesses, it says, "They shall lie in the street of the great city, which spiritually is called Sodom and Egypt, where our Lord was crucified." Now remember that the book of Revelation is using symbols here. So what is this great city that it's talking about? A city where the Lord was crucified. Now we know the Lord was actually crucified in Jerusalem, but who was he actually put to death by? He was actually put to death by the Roman authorities, and at that time Jerusalem was part of the Roman Empire. So what this is saying is really the great city is Rome. And it says that, which is spiritually called Sodom and Egypt. So the Lord Jesus Christ, we know, was put to death in the Roman Empire, and so the Roman Empire was responsible for the death of our Lord. Now, it mentions that the dead bodies are going to be in the street of the great city, the street or a part of the Roman Empire. And we believe that that's talking about France. Now, I've got here on the top of the thing here, France, the nation of France was actually quite a very special nation in the history of the Catholic Church. France was one of the first countries to be made Catholic, but it also, France under Charlemagne was also supported the Pope and fought against the Pope's enemies. And out of thankfulness for that, the papacy called France the eldest son of the church. So France was always held in high regard by the Catholic Church. And it was said one of the most important protectors of the papacy. And that's where, as we said, this is where the witnesses were going to die. Politically, the witnesses were going to die in France, and they were also going to be resurrected in France as well, at the same place, as we're going to see. And the amazing thing about all these things that we're looking at now is we're going to see shortly also how there were people living around this time who actually saw the same thing that we see, but they saw it before it happened. Okay, so we've got now Revelation 11, verses 9 to 11 on the screen, which I'll just read out. It says there that, and they of the people and the kindreds and the tongues and nations shall see the dead bodies 3 days and a half, and shall not suffer their dead bodies to be put into graves. And they that dwell upon the earth shall rejoice over them, make merry, and shall send gifts one to another, because these two prophets tormented them that dwelt on the earth. And after 3 days and a half, the Spirit of life from God entered into them, and they stood upon their feet, and great fear fell upon them which saw them. So it's talking about a time when these two witnesses were going to die politically, that their dead bodies, as it were going to lie in the street for 3.5 days, and after that they were going to be resurrected, as it were. They were going to stand on their feet. So we saw how they were going to die. They died in 1685 at the death, at the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. Now we're just going to talk about the symbolic time period. So we said that the witnesses were going to die politically, and 3.5 days later they are raised politically. And we believe that, as Brother Thomas said, the 3.5 days symbolically we're going to use lunar days, which are 30 days, and it comes to 105 years. You can see that down the bottom. 1 lunar day is 30 of our days. 3.5 lunar days times 30 is 105 days, which equals 105 years. Now, you might ask the question, why didn't it say that the dead bodies were going to lie in the street for 105 days instead of 3.5 days? Because if it had 105 days, then you only have to do a day for a year translation. 105 to 100 days is 105 years. But the answer is because of the decorum of the symbol. And what that means is that the symbol, you could believe that a dead body was in the street literally for 3.5 days. We can probably believe that, the dead body, but you wouldn't leave a dead body on the street for 105 days. That just doesn't happen. And that's why we are using the 3.5 day, or why Revelation uses 3.5 days as a symbol, as part of the decorum symbol. So we believe that time period, as it says, 105 years, and that is this time period here. It starts at 1685, which is the death of the witnesses politically, and 105 years later is 1789. Now, what's amazing about this is that we can say this now, like looking back and think, oh yeah, you might say, oh, we're just making this up after the event. But as we're going to see in some slides, a couple of slides afterwards, there were people who were living at that time who were reading their Bible, and they came to exactly the same conclusion. Okay, so here we have on the chart, again, I hope it's not too complicated, but what we're talking about, the death of the two witnesses. So we've got here, the two witnesses begin their witnessing. They're called the woman and the earth in Revelation 12. They witness for 1260 years. They begin to be slaughtered at 1572. Their final death, extreme political death, occurs at 1685. And then there's the 3.5 days, 105 years, where they're going to be left dead in the street, as it were, symbolically, but they're going to be raised from the dead at 1789, which you might know is a French Revolution. So we'll look at that shortly. Now, we mentioned before that we said that other people who were living around that time or before that time actually predicted these things. And one of them was this Protestant pastor. I think he's actually a Frenchman as well. His name's Peter Giraud. He's got a picture here on the right-hand side. Now, he predicts the death of the two witnesses. So this is what he says. It is one of the keys of Revelation to understand that the great city signifies not Rome alone, but Rome in conjunction with its empire. This being supposed and proved, then in my opinion, we cannot doubt that the 10th part of the city is France. It is also the street or the place of the city that is the most fair and eminent part of it. I lay not down the exact time of the resurrection of the witnesses, but I strongly hope that the 3.5 years began at the time of the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. So this was published in 1687. That's 2 years after that. So he's saying, I believe that the death of the witnesses occurred in France. He believed that the death of the witnesses, the final death, occurred in 1685. He says, I strongly hope that's when it happened. That's when the 3.5 years began. So this is a person who saw it, was living around that time period, and he predicted it, the beginning of that. So that's pretty amazing. But that's not all he predicted, as we're going to see in the next slide, I think. He says this, the 10th part of the city which here fell will at some future time appear to be the kingdom of France, where a revolution will take place about the year 1785. A separation of the papacy will follow when names of monks, nuns, Carmelites, Augustines, and Dominicans shall perish forever, and all those vain titles and armorial bearings which serve for ornament and pride shall vanish, and brotherly love will make all men equal. So he's actually he predicts the French Revolution, and he's only out by about 4 years. So that's pretty amazing. He predicts that revolution is going to be in France. It's about the year 1785, well, he's 4 years out, and he made the prediction 100 years before it happened. And he could correctly interpret the 10th part of the city as France. He saw that they were going to, the revolution of France was going to be based upon liberty, equality, fraternity, and he correctly understood the 3.5 days as representing 105 years. So he's a person who saw it before it happened. So that's pretty amazing. And he did that by reading his Bible and understanding the book of Revelation. Okay, so we'll just basically now just read it then about the resurrection of the witnesses in Revelation 11 to 13. It says there in Revelation 11, and after 3 days and a half, the Spirit of life from God entered into them, and they stood upon their feet, and great fear fell upon them which saw them. And they heard a great voice from heaven saying unto them, Come up hither. And they ascended up to heaven in a cloud, and their enemies beheld them. At the same hour was there a great earthquake. A 10th part of the city fell, and in the earthquake were slain of men 7,000, and the remnant were affrighted and gave glory to the God of heaven. So we believe that this resurrection of these witnesses occurred at the French Revolution in 1789. And it's interesting here that during the French Revolution, they did remember the witnesses previously that were dead, because in that part of the revolution, they said we want to give back the property of the exiled Huguenots, who were the Protestants. They should be restored to their rightful heirs. So the resurrection of the two witnesses, as a result of that, as a result of the French Revolution, it struck terror in France because the people rose up and were fighting and causing civil unrest everywhere. And because the king was so scared, King Louis XVI, I think it was, he actually called the Parliament in 23 August 1789 to try to calm the people who were all rebelling. But when he did that, things got out of control, and eventually the Parliament, which was then called the National Assembly, got control of the government, and eventually the king would be overthrown. So we can see here the French Revolution was based upon the rights of man. These were here, again, the two witnesses rising from the dead, as it were, politically, and they were fighting against the Catholic system and the Catholic rulership of France. And we can be really grateful for this resurrection of the two witnesses of the French Revolution, because from that time, democracy started taking over France and eventually would take over the world. And as it says here, the Bible Society was founded shortly after the French Revolution, and the Bible was circulated all over the world. And because of the French Revolution, religious liberty and freedom of worship in our day owes much to these work of the two witnesses, because now we can enjoy a freedom, although things might stop that now with certain events happening with in the politics. But up to now, we actually have freedom of worship for many hundreds of years since the French Revolution, and that was caused by the resurrection of the two witnesses. So we should be grateful for that we can preach, we can read the Bible without fear of persecution in most parts of the world. So that verse which we read about here in verse 12, it says, "I heard a great voice from heaven." That's talking again about the political heavens. Remember, the book of Revelation is a book of symbol. "And said unto them, Come up hither, and they ascended up to heaven in a cloud, and their enemies beheld them." So what that's talking about was, again, that the voice from heaven was actually the King Louis the 16th, because he saw the people that were rebelling. He was in the political heaven, he was in power, and he was really afraid of all this rioting of the people during the French Revolution. He said, "Look, you can form a government, you can form the Parliament." And that's what they did, and that gave them power, political power, and then they were really up. It says their enemies beheld them. So the previous rulers, who was the king, royalty, the clerical, that is the priests, and the aristocracy, the rich people, they were really afraid because they could see the common people getting political power now, and they could see that they were going to lose their power. And that's exactly what happened. Once these people got into power during the French Revolution, they started putting to death a lot of the royalty, the king and the queen, and the priests and the monks and all the rest. They confiscated lands, and so the Catholicism was thrown out the door in France especially. And so that was a great victory, again, of the two witnesses over the God of the earth, over Catholicism, because of the French Revolution, and because the common people got power through this National Assembly, through the Parliament of France. So this verse here, which talks about the same man was a great earthquake, that's the earthquake of the French Revolution. The 10th part of the city fell, that is France, which is one of the 10 horns of the Roman Empire, one of the nations. And it mentions there the slain of men 7,000. Well, that's just a representative number of the rulerships. And then it says the remnants were scared and gave glory to the God of heaven, which we'll look at shortly. So this was a great political earthquake of the French Revolution. And it set the things that happened during the French Revolution, and initially just affected France, but over time, those spirits of the French Revolution would affect the whole world. And we know today that most of the Western world especially is affected by the spirits of the French Revolution, of democracy and equality and those sort of things. And the main thing is it greatly reduced the power of the papacy and the Catholic Church. So I've got here just a note about the 7,000 names of men that were destroyed. It just talks about really they got rid of all the rich people, the royal people, and also the clergy. They all lost their positions, and a lot of times they lost their lives. And the Catholic religion itself, as it says here, for a short period of time in France, was actually abolished, and they established the goddess of reason. And later on, it mentions down the bottom here that they acknowledged the supreme being. So it says here they gave glory to the God of heaven. So they got rid of Catholicism, and in the end, they were worshipping the supreme being, which is God. And so we can see how these things were fulfilled in the French Revolution. And it was such a great event that when the French Revolution actually happened, a lot of the other nations were so scared that they actually invaded France and tried to stop it, which they never did successfully. So we're coming now really to the end of the sixth trumpet, because that is the French Revolution. So it says here in verse 11, verse 14, the second woe is past, which is also the sixth trumpet. Behold, the third woe cometh. So this takes us to the end of the sixth, or the second woe trumpet, and it's taken a long time to sound. And this trumpet, as we said, had two parts. The first part was to put to death the Greek Catholic dominion with its centre of government in Constantinople, the Eastern Roman Empire. The second part dealt with the tormenting Catholic Europe in the West. Okay, so now we're going to just conclude briefly, very briefly, on the seventh trumpet begins to sound. And this is the last few verses of chapter 11. So in Revelation 11, verse 15, it says, the seventh angel sounded, and there was great voices in heaven saying, the kingdoms of this world have become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever. So the seventh trumpet really began to sound in 1789 of the French Revolution, and it's still sounding now. We are still living in the seventh trumpet period. It's also known as the third woe. Now, as you can see here from that verse, the final picture of the kingdom is mentioned first. So we know, for example, now the kingdoms of the world are not yet established, but that will happen at the end of the seventh trumpet period. So I've got here the final vision first. At the sounding of this trumpet, the final picture is given first, and then progressive details to follow describe how the end is reached. And this is frequently the case in Scripture. So it goes on to say that the nations were angry during the seventh trumpet period, and your wrath is come at the time of the dead, that they should be judged, and that you should reward your servants and the prophets and the saints and those that fear your name, small and great, and you shall destroy those who destroy the earth. So again, it's talking about this seventh trumpet period, a period which began with the French Revolution, when the nations were going to be angry. And we can see today the nations are angry because of the effects of the French Revolution. Everyone's complaining and protesting about one thing or another. But the time is coming, as that verse said, when the time of the dead and that they should be judged. And we know that's shortly going to happen. When that happens, we know that Christ has returned and that we'll face judgment as well. So, and then at that time, when Christ comes and the dead are raised, then it says God's going to destroy those who destroy the earth. And it says here now, at this last verse of chapter 11, it says the temple of God was opened in heaven, and there was seen in his temple the ark of his testament, and there was lightnings and voices and thunderings and an earthquake and great hail. So as we come to the end of chapter 11, which talks about this seventh trumpet period, which talks about here really the return of Christ and the saints, you notice there it says that the temple of God was opened in heaven. Now again, remember the temple of God is talking about Christ and the believers. And you remember how we looked at the first verse of chapter 11, which said that the temple of God was going to be trodden down for 42 months. So chapter 11 begins with the true believers being trodden down for 42 months, being persecuted, but it ends with Christ's return and the saints as a temple of God are in heaven. That is, they're in the political heaven, they're in power. So this verse is talking about us and all those other saints that lived in the past, have been raised and been given immortality. They're all going to be part of the political heavens when Christ returns at Armageddon, especially. And then, as it says there, after Armageddon, there's still going to be lightnings, voices, and thunderings, and an earthquake and great hail. And that's talking about really what we saw in Revelation 10, the seven thunders. So there's still going to be judgments, even after Christ and the saints gain political power in Jerusalem after the destruction of Armageddon. That's only the beginning. There's still a work of bringing judgments to the world through the seven thunders. But here again would have been a comforting vision for those people that were persecuted, 1,000 years ago or so. Those saints could see that one day, even though they might lose their lives, they are going to be part of that temple of God. They're going to be ruling with Christ when he returns. So that would have given them a great deal of comfort. I think I'll skip ahead. So that's what we just said there. Basically, the lightnings, voices, and thunderings are the same that we saw in chapter 4, and it's talking about the other judgments that are going to come to the world when Christ returns, and what the rainbowed angel mentioned in that time. So, brothers and sisters, as we can see, these things that have happened in the past concerning the witnesses, their death, the resurrection, the French Revolution giving us freedom to worship, which is a good thing, but let us always be encouraged that even though this world is very evil and we can see lots of problems with it, that shortly Christ is going to come and that we are going to rule with him. Just as we have suffered, we are going to rule with him and bring about God's purpose with this earth, which is to fill it with his glory.